In 1876, 11 fur traders entered the Siberian taiga along an uncharted route northeast of Yeniseisk. By the fourth night, something was walking the tree line. Only 7 of them came home. My name is Pyotr Alexeyevich Volkov. I was born in 1848 in the village of Kozhevnikovo in the Tomsk Governorate, and I spent the better part of my working life moving between trading posts and river stations across western Siberia. I was 28 years old in the autumn of 1876, and I had already made 6 seasonal trapping runs into the deep forest before that year. I knew the taiga the way a man knows the face of his own father. I knew its moods, I knew its silences. I knew the difference between a forest that was merely cold and a forest that was holding its breath. What I encountered in the winter of 1876, in the unnamed timber country north of the Podkamennaya-Tunguska River, changed the way I understood the world. Not immediately. It took years before I was able to speak of it plainly, and more years still before I stopped waking in the night certain that something large was standing just outside whatever room I was sleeping in, patient as stone, waiting for the fire to die down. I am 81 years old as I dictate this account. My hands no longer cooperate with a pen, and so I am grateful to my granddaughter Irina, who has agreed to transcribe my words without interruption or editorial correction, as I have specifically requested. I want this told the way I remember it. Not polished, not explained away. I want it recorded before I die, so that at least one honest document exists about what happened to the Volkov party in the taiga northeast of Yeniseisk in the year of our Lord, 1876. I will begin from the beginning. The expedition was organized by a merchant named Grigory Semyonovich Balashov, who operated out of Yeniseisk and had built a modest fortune trading furs through contacts as far east as Irkutsk. Balashov was in his mid-40s at the time, a broad-shouldered man with a red beard going gray at the chin and the particular kind of confidence that comes from having made money in difficult places. He had heard reports from a Tungus trapper named Kacha, who worked the river territories east of the Yenisei, and that a section of forest between 2 unnamed tributaries of the Podkamennaya held sable populations so dense that you could set a line of 30 traps in an afternoon and return in 48 hours to find every one of them taken. Balashov had repeated this claim to me twice before I fully believed he was serious about acting on it. Sable was the most valuable fur in the Siberian trade. A single high-quality pelt could fetch prices that made a man's seasonal earnings from fox and ermine look like a child's pocket money. If Kacha's information was even partially accurate, a single good run through that territory could set a man up for 3 winters. There were 11 of us who agreed to go. Besides Balashov and myself, there were 2 brothers from Krasnoyarsk named Fedor and Mikhail Orlov, who were experienced trappers with a reputation for working well in extreme cold. There was a former military man named Sergeant Timofey Gusev, who had served in a border garrison and joined the fur trade after his discharge, and who carried himself with a kind of quiet steadiness that made you glad to have him nearby when conditions turned difficult. There was a Cossack trader named Zakhar Lipov, who was loud and generous with his tobacco, and who had made the eastern run before, though never this far north. There was a young man named Nikolai Andreev, who was barely 20 years old and on his first serious expedition, hired as a general hand to manage the pack animals and tend fires. There were also 3 Evenki guides, a father and 2 adult sons, whose Russian names we used in camp. The father was called Stepan, and his sons were Vasily and Ivan. And there was one more man, a Yeniseisk merchant's clerk named Dmitry Fokin, who had attached himself to the party as an unofficial recorder and bookkeeper, keeping a ledger of supplies and distances that I still have in a box somewhere in this house. Fokin was the one who began writing things down. I want to say something about the Evenki guides before I go further. Stepan was approximately 60 years of age, though Evenki men of that generation were often older than they appeared from hard living, and he had guided parties through this general region before, though never along the specific route Balashov had plotted from Katya's descriptions. From the beginning of the journey, Stepan was willing and professional. He identified game sign, assessed ice thickness on the smaller waterways we crossed, advised on campsite selection, and communicated in a mixture of broken Russian and gestures that Balashov had learned to interpret well enough over years of working with Evenki and Ket guides. His sons were quieter men, competent and watchful, and they communicated more with each other than with the rest of the party. I noticed, early in the journey, that the three of them had a habit of looking at the tree line at dusk. We departed Yeniseisk on the 14th of September, 1876. This was not an ideal start date for a northern run. Conventional wisdom among Siberian fur traders held that you wanted to be deep in territory by the 1st of October at the latest, to take full advantage of the cold snap that drove sable into their most active foraging patterns. Balashov had been delayed by a dispute with a supplier over the quality of traded steel traps, and we lost nearly 2 weeks to that argument. We were therefore pushing into territory that would be genuinely cold within weeks, not the pleasant cold of early autumn, but the serious, bone-seating cold of November in the taiga, where temperatures could drop to -30°C, and the forest at night became a place of absolute, crystalline stillness. We had 11 pack horses loaded with supplies and equipment, trap lines bundled in oilcloth, provisions for 60 days, 2 tents of heavy canvas, and enough firewood starting material to ensure we could get a blaze going in nearly any conditions. Balashov had been thorough in his preparations, whatever else might be said of his judgment. The horses were good animals, Siberian bred and accustomed to cold, though they would become a liability later, as I will describe. The first 2 weeks of travel were uneventful in the way that a long journey through beautiful wilderness is uneventful. We followed the Yenisei north for 3 days before cutting northeast along a series of smaller waterways that Stepan knew from previous journeys. The forest in this section was mixed taiga, birch and larch, giving way to denser stands of Siberian pine as we moved north and gained elevation. The ground was still largely unfrozen in the first week, the soil dark and soft underfoot, and the forest was filled with the ordinary sounds of autumn. Wind moving through the upper canopy, the distant hammer of a woodpecker, the occasional call of a Siberian jay following our column for scraps. And the light in the taiga in September has a quality I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone who has not seen it. It falls in long, angled columns through the canopy and turns the air between the trees a particular shade of gold and amber in the late afternoon, and everything beneath it looks ancient and deeply present, as if the forest itself is aware of you walking through it. We made good time. Stepan knew the river crossings and guided us through 2 that would have been treacherous for the horses if approached at the wrong angle. By the end of the 2nd week, we had covered perhaps 240 kilometers from Yeniseisk, moving northeast, and we were entering territory that Stepan had not personally visited before, though he seemed to know it from description, and he had conferred twice in that period with Balashov over the hand-drawn map that Katya had provided, comparing landmarks and orientating by the river bends and ridge lines that Katya had sketched in charcoal on birch bark. On the evening of the 28th of September, we made camp on the western bank of a narrow river that none of us had a name for. It was a good campsite, elevated slightly above the water, protected on 2 sides by a dense stand of Siberian pine with clear sight lines to the north and south. We set both tents and built a large fire in the center, and the mood that evening was relaxed and optimistic. Balashov opened a bottle of vodka he had been saving and passed it around. Aganzaka Lipov told a long and indecent story about a bear and a merchant's wife that made even the Evenki brothers laugh, despite not understanding half the words. The forest around us was quiet in the way of a forest settling into its evening. and the sky through the tree canopy showed a clean, hard arrangement of stars that told us the weather would hold. I am describing that evening in detail because I want you to understand what it felt like to be comfortable there, to feel at home, to feel that the wilderness around us was familiar and manageable, the ordinary wilderness of a professional outdoorsman's working life. I want you to understand that feeling because of what came after. I woke at some point in the early morning hours of the 29th in the tent I shared with Fokin and Andreev, and I lay still for a moment before I understood what had pulled me out of sleep. The fire had died down to coals. The forest outside was completely silent, not the gentle quiet of a sleeping woodland, but a different kind of silence, the silence of suspended breath, the silence of every small creature between the trees having gone perfectly still at once. I'd been in the taiga long enough to recognize that silence. It meant a predator was close. Wolf, usually. Sometimes bear, though bears were generally denning by this point in the season. I lay still and listened and heard nothing but that absolute quiet. And then, very clearly, from somewhere beyond the northern tree line, I heard a sound I could not immediately categorize. It was low, lower than a wolf howl, lower than the territorial call of a bear. It was a single, sustained note, and somewhere between a groan and a resonant hum, and it lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds before it ceased. The silence that followed it was even more complete than the silence before it. I lay still for a long time. The sound did not repeat. Gradually, after perhaps 20 minutes, I heard the distant tapping of a small bird in the trees and knew that the forest had resumed its ordinary nighttime life. I turned over and went back to sleep, and in the morning, over tea, I mentioned what I had heard to Gusev. He nodded slowly and said he had heard it too. We said nothing more about it. Men in the field do not generally dwell on unidentified night sounds. Every forest has its acoustic peculiarities. Sound travels strangely in cold air, and strange things sound stranger still when you are half asleep and far from any settlement. Gusev was not a man given to unease, and his nod had been the nod of a man filing information away, rather than the nod of a man frightened, and I took my cue from him. We struck camp, loaded the horses, and continued northeast. On the morning of the 1st of October, Andreev came to where I was checking the straps on the lead pack horse and told me quietly that he had found something in the snow at the northern edge of the camp perimeter. It had snowed lightly overnight, perhaps 3 centimeters, enough to dust the ground and the pine branches, but not enough to impede travel. Andreev led me to the tree line and pointed at the snow, and I crouched down and looked at what he had found. They were depressions. 3 of them in a rough line, spaced about 1.5 meters apart. They were large, perhaps 45 to 50 centimeters across, and they were roughly oval in shape, though their edges were not clean enough to show precise detail. The snow in this part of the forest was shallow over frozen ground, and the depressions had compressed the snow without breaking through to the soil beneath, which made them difficult to read precisely. They could have been made by a large animal. A moose makes a large impression in soft snow, though the moose track has a distinctive cloven shape, and these did not appear to. A bear, though bears were not moving now. I looked at the spacing, and I looked at the shape, and I stood up, and I said nothing for a moment. Stepan appeared at my shoulder. I had not heard him approach. He looked at the depressions for a long time without speaking, and then he looked at the tree line to the north. And then he said something in Evenki to his sons, who had come up behind him. Ivan responded quietly. Stepan turned to Balashov, who had come over, and said in his broken Russian that these were old tracks and that they were probably from a large elk that had passed in the night. Balashov accepted this and moved on. I watched Stepan's face while he said it. I had been watching Evenki guides for 6 years, and I knew the difference between a man who believes what he is saying and a man who is saying what he believes the situation requires. Stepan did not believe what he was saying. We moved on that day and made another 18 kilometers northeast through dense pine forest that grew increasingly close and uniform as we traveled. The sky had clouded over and the light was flat and gray, so the kind of light that makes distance judgment difficult in forest terrain. The horses were subdued. I noticed this in the afternoon, the way the animals had stopped their normal traveling behavior, the casual head tossing and occasional whickering that horses do in company. They were moving with their ears pressed back and their heads low and their eyes white-rimmed. Horses read environments differently than humans, and they communicate distress plainly if you know how to look for it. I moved up beside Andreev, who was managing the pack string, and asked him quietly how long the horses had been behaving this way. He said since midday, since we had entered this particular section of forest. I looked at the trees around us. They were large pines, very old, with trunks perhaps a meter across, their lower branches dead and interlocked. The undergrowth between them was minimal, which gave the forest a particular quality of visibility. You could see 50 or 60 meters into the trees in most directions, but the angle of light and the regularity of the trunks created a visual rhythm that was almost disorienting, a repeated pattern that your eye moved over without ever settling on a point of focus. It was like trying to read a page of text where every letter was identical. Nothing moved in those trees that afternoon. But the horses did not calm, and I did not fully calm either, and by the time we made camp on the 2nd of October, I was aware of a tension across my shoulder blades that had not been there the week before. That night, Fokin began keeping his separate journal. He had been maintaining the expedition ledger since the start, as I mentioned, and recording distances and inventory and weather. But on the evening of the 2nd of October, he began writing in a separate notebook, a personal account, and he told me about it when I asked what he was doing. He said he wanted to record certain observations that did not belong in the official ledger. He was a careful, methodical man. Fokin, a clerk by training and temperament, and the fact that he felt the need to keep a private account of something told me more than any explicit statement would have. I asked him what observations. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said that on 3 consecutive nights he had woken in the early morning hours with the strong and specific sensation of being watched from outside the tent. Not from a vague direction, but from a particular location, the northeast side of the tent, Mars approximately 10 to 15 meters distant. He said the sensation was so precise that he had been able to point to the exact spot each time before going outside to check it, and each time he had found nothing there but that the snow at that spot had been disturbed in a way consistent with large footfalls, and that the disturbances were fresh. He had not told Balashov. He had not told anyone. He was telling me now, he said, because he wanted another person to know that he had observed this, in case something happened to his notebook. I did not sleep well that night. The 3rd and 4th of October passed without incident. Or rather, they passed with the kind of incident that a man trained in self-reassurance can convince himself to dismiss. On the evening of the 3rd, and the horses refused to stand at their usual tethering line on the northern edge of camp and had to be relocated to the south side. On the morning of the 4th, we found that a tied bundle of smoked fish, suspended from a pine branch at a height of nearly 3 meters to keep it from ground predators, had been removed overnight. The rawhide binding was still knotted on the branch. Whatever had taken the bundle had lifted it clean off the hanging point without disturbing the knot. Balashov said a wolverine had done it, and that wolverines were climbers of remarkable ability, and this was technically true, though the bundle weighed perhaps 8 kilograms and the branch from which it had hung was thick enough that an animal climbing it would have left clear claw marks on the bark. I examined the bark. There were no claw marks, and I said nothing to Balashov. That evening, as we sat around the fire in the early darkness of a Siberian October night, I watched the tree line. I'd begun doing this systematically by this point, scanning the perimeter at regular intervals, noting the quality of darkness between the trunks. The fire was well built and threw a reasonable circle of light, perhaps 15 meters in radius, enough to see the near trunks clearly and the middle distance in outline. Beyond that, the darkness was absolute, as it is in deep forest on a clouded night with no moon. At some point during the early evening, while Zakhar Lipov was talking and Fedor Orlov was laughing, and the fire was burning well and the camp was as animated as it had been on any night of the journey, I saw something move in the tree line to the northeast. It was at the edge of the firelight, right at that boundary where illumination becomes suggestion. What I saw, or what I believed I saw, was a shift in the darkness between two large pine trunks. Not a passing shadow, not the movement of a branch in wind. A deliberate lateral shift, something moving from behind one trunk to behind another, something that paused between them for a moment before completing the movement, as if it had noticed me looking and stopped. The space between those two trunks was, by my estimate, approximately 2 meters across. Whatever had moved between them had filled that space. I kept my expression level. I said nothing. I looked around the fire at the other men, and none of them had noticed anything. I looked back at the tree line and saw only darkness and the static shapes of trunks. And I kept watching that spot for the next hour without seeing anything further. When I went to bed that night, I lay awake for a long time. In the morning, I walked to those 2 trees before the camp was fully awake. The snow between them was disturbed, large compressions in the crust, deep enough that whatever had made them was very heavy indeed. They faced south, toward the camp, and they were separated by a stride length that I measured with my own steps, 4 of my steps between impressions. I am a man of average height, and my stride in snow is approximately 70 centimeters. That puts the stride length of whatever made these impressions at approximately 2 meters and 80 centimeters. I stood in that snow for a long moment. Then I went back to camp, drank my tea, and said nothing. Then we set trap lines on the 5th and 6th of October. The territory was, in fact, as productive as Katya had described. We found sable sign within 2 hours of leaving the main camp, fresh tracks and the distinctive shallow excavations where the animals had been digging beneath the snow for cached food. Balashov was in excellent spirits. The Orlov brothers set a line of 40 traps through a particularly promising section of forest along a frozen tributary, and Gusev and I ran a secondary line to the northeast. Zakhar Lipov and Andreev maintained the camp and tended the horses. I want to be specific about what the forest felt like in those 2 days of trap setting, because I think it is important to understand the experience of working in a place you believe is being watched. The taiga in early October is, after the first serious cold has come, is a place of enormous stillness and austere beauty. The snow between the trees is clean and white, and every track upon it tells a story. You can read the overnight movements of every animal in the vicinity, the delicate pointed prints of a sable, the broad-footed impression of a snowshoe hare, the chain stitch of a vole moving between root systems. The forest speaks in tracks to anyone who knows how to read it. Working those lines with Gusev, I was aware at all times of the absence of certain tracks. Wolf tracks. I had not seen a wolf track since the 3rd of October. Wolves are not absent from the deep taiga. They are among its most consistent presences. Their tracks should have been crossing ours regularly. They were not. The sable and hare sign was abundant, which told me that the absence of wolf sign was not a function of general wildlife scarcity. Something had moved the wolves out of this section of forest. I mentioned this to Gusev. He looked at the ground for a long moment and then said, quietly and without drama, that he had noticed the same thing 2 days prior. He said that in 15 years of working in and around the taiga, he had never moved through a stretch of forest that had active small prey populations but no predator sign at all. He said it felt wrong. He said the word wrong the way a soldier uses it, not as a complaint, but as an assessment. On the evening of the 6th of October, after the trap lines were set and the camp was quiet, Stepan came to sit beside me at the fire. His sons had gone to the tent. Balashov was reviewing his ledger with Fokin, and the other men were talking quietly at the far side of the fire. Stepan sat beside me and stoked the fire with a long branch, and for a while said nothing. Then he said, in his careful broken Russian, that the forest here had a name among his people. I asked him what the name was. He said the word slowly, in Evenki, and then said he did not have a direct Russian translation, but that the closest meaning was something like the place where the Old One lives, or perhaps the territory of the Ancient Watcher. He said that his father had told him about this territory, and that his father's father had told his father, and that the instruction passed down through those generations was clear and specific. You could pass through this forest, but you could not stay in it. You could travel through it, and the Old One would observe you and let you go. But if you stayed, if you built fires and set traps and established yourself as permanent, you were announcing that you intended to take from its territory, and it would respond to that. I asked him what it looked like. He considered for a long time. Then he said it was very large. He said it had been seen only a few times by any of his people, and that those who had seen it described it differently, but that all the descriptions agreed on its size, which was beyond what a man could properly hold in his mind, and on its behavior, which was patient and deliberate, and on one other quality, that it could stand among the trees in a way that made it nearly invisible, the way a pike holds still in deep water and becomes part of the river bottom until it moves. He said this last part slowly, as if he was being careful with the translation. And then he looked at the tree line to the northeast, and then he looked at me. I asked him what he thought we should do. He said we should leave, not in the morning, now tonight, as soon as the horses could be loaded. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told him I would speak to Balashov. Balashov listened to me relay Stepan's account with the expression of a businessman calculating loss against profit. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said that Evenki folklore was full of territorial forest spirits, and that Stepan was a good guide, but not a rational man when it came to matters of local superstition. He said we had 2 days of trap lines set, and he was not pulling them without a single night's return. He said we would check the lines in the morning, pack the pelts, and then make a decision after seeing what the yield looked like. I told him about the footprints near the trees. I told him about the fish bundle. He said wolverines were remarkable climbers, and that large elk left unusual impressions in hard-packed snow. I told him I had measured the stride. He looked at me for a moment, and then he said that distances in the field were hard to assess accurately, and that he trusted me to keep my head. Then he went back to his ledger. I sat with Stepan and told him what Balashov had said. Stepan nodded slowly. He did not look surprised. He said that he would not leave without the party, because he had made a commitment to guide us, and he was a man who honored commitments. But he asked me to understand that from this night forward, his sons would not sleep, and they would sit awake at the fire through the night and watch. He said I should do the same if I was wise. I did not sleep that night. I sat at the fire with Vasily and Ivan, and the 3 of us watched the tree line through the long dark hours, and the forest was utterly silent, and nothing moved in the trees that I could see, and the fire burned steadily, and at some point, near what I judged to be the 3rd hour of the morning, the horses began to tremble. Not the sudden start of a spooked animal, a sustained, deep trembling that went through all 11 of them simultaneously, the way a vibration passes through a structure. They did not cry out. They did not pull at their tethers. They simply trembled, with their heads very low and their ears flat and their eyes showing white, all facing away from the northeast, all pressed against the southern edge of their tethering line as if trying to put maximum distance between themselves and something on the other side of the camp. I looked northeast. There was nothing visible in the tree line. But the silence was different. It was the silence from the first night multiplied. It was a silence with a presence in it, the way a room with a large animal in it has a different quality of air than an empty room, even before you see the animal. Vasily, sitting to my right, had gone completely still. He was not looking at the tree line. He was looking at the fire. His hands were folded in his lap and his lips were moving very slightly, and I recognized after a moment that he was speaking something in a low rhythmic murmur, a repetition, something between a prayer and a recitation. Ivan, on his other side, was doing the same. I looked back at the tree line. For a long moment I saw only darkness and trunks, and then I saw the eyes. I want to be precise about this because I have spent 40 years trying to be certain of what I saw. They were not 2 points of light in the darkness the way an animal's eyes catch the fire and reflect it. They were more than that. They were illuminated from within, a deep amber gold color, and they were set apart from each other by a distance that I estimated at that moment to be perhaps 40 centimeters. That is a wide interocular spacing, wider than a moose, which has the widest eye spacing of any animal I know. The eyes were high above the ground, higher than any animal I was aware of. I could not see a body. I could not see a silhouette. The trees were large enough, and the darkness complete enough that whatever was standing there was simply absorbed into the vertical geometry of the trunks. But the eyes were there, and they were looking at the fire, and they were perfectly still. I did not move. I did not call out. Every instinct I had was telling me to be very small and very quiet and to make no sudden change in the situation. I watched the eyes for what felt like a very long time but was probably no more than 2 or 3 minutes. Then, slowly, without any sound I could hear, they were gone. Not extinguished. Gone, as if whatever held them had turned away or moved back into the trees. The absence was as complete as their presence had been. The horses stopped trembling after a few minutes. The forest slowly, incrementally, resumed its ordinary small sounds. Vasily stopped his murmuring and let out a long, controlled breath. Ivan refueled the fire with 2 large sections of pine from our wood pile. None of us said a word until the sky began to gray in the east. In the morning I told Gusev what I had seen. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he asked me 2 questions. How high above the ground had the eyes appeared to be, and had there been any sound at all accompanying the sighting? I told him the eyes had appeared to be at a height of perhaps 2.5 to 3 meters from the ground, and that there had been no sound whatever. He nodded. He said he believed me. He said he had heard Fokin moving around in the tent near the end of the night, and that Fokin had also apparently been unable to sleep. I went to Fokin and found him already writing in his private notebook. And he looked up at me, and his face had the careful neutrality of a man who has decided to be composed about something that has genuinely frightened him. He said that from inside the tent in the early hours of the morning, he had heard a sound like breathing. Not the breathing of a sleeping man nearby. A slower and deeper respiration, more like the sound of a large bellows than a lung, and it had been very close to the tent wall on the northeast side, perhaps half a meter outside the canvas, and it had lasted for approximately 4 to 5 minutes before ceasing. He said he had not moved or spoken during those 4 to 5 minutes. He said he had lain with every muscle rigid and his eyes open in the darkness of the tent. And he had listened to that deep, slow breath moving in and out, moment he had been more frightened than he had ever been in his life. He wrote all of this in his notebook, and then he looked at me and said that he thought we should leave. Checking the trap lines that morning produced the finest single-day return I had seen in 6 years of Siberian work. 43 sable from the Orlov brothers' line, 17 from the line Gusev and I had set. Balashov could not contain his satisfaction. He sat in the snow counting and recounting pelts with the expression of a man who has found exactly what he came for. The quality was exceptional, thick-furred winter pelts in prime condition, the kind that would bring the highest prices at the Yeniseisk market. He said we would set the lines again for 1 more night's run and pull everything the morning after. 2 more nights in camp and we would leave with enough to justify the entire expedition several times over. I took him aside and told him about the eyes. I told him about the breathing outside the tent. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, with real seriousness in his voice and not the dismissiveness of before, that he understood my concern and that he respected my experience. He said 2 more nights. He said we would set a double watch and build a larger fire, and that if anything happened during those nights, we would leave immediately, regardless of the traps. He said 2 more nights and enough sable to retire comfortably on. I looked at him, and I thought about the eyes in the dark, and I thought about the breathing 4 to 5 minutes outside the canvas of the tent. I did not have the authority to order anyone to leave. Then Balashov was the expedition leader. I was an experienced hand, not a partner. I could leave myself alone, and I thought about this seriously for a moment, but I thought about Andreev, who was 20 years old and on his first expedition, and I thought about Fokin with his careful notebook, and I did not leave. I went to Stepan and told him Balashov's decision. Stepan received it without expression. He said he would continue to watch through the night. He said his sons would do the same. He said he wanted to tell me one more thing, which was that in the old stories about this place, the thing that lived here had never directly harmed a person who was passing through. It had watched, it had followed, it had taken things from camps, supplies left out, equipment, food, and it had made itself known in ways that were intended to be understood as a message. You are in my territory, and I know you are here. The harm came in the old stories only when people refused the message, only when they stayed and took again. He looked at me steadily when he said this last part. The night of the 7th of October passed in a state of maximum vigilance. Gusev and I took the first watch, the Evenki brothers the second. Balashov himself took a portion of the third watch, which surprised me, and I think reflected the fact that he had taken my account seriously, even while not being willing to alter the plan because of it. The fire was built large and kept burning bright through the night. We had arranged the camp so that nothing could approach from the northeast without crossing a substantial open space, and Gusev had his rifle across his lap for the entire watch. The night was quiet, deeply, completely quiet, the same suspended silence we had experienced before, but no eyes appeared in the tree line, no breathing was heard at the tent walls, no sound rolled through the forest from the north. The horses were uneasy, pressed to their southern tethers, ears flat, but they did not tremble as they had the previous night. By morning, with pale light filling the canopy and an inch of new snow on the ground from a quiet overnight fall, several of us were allowing ourselves to believe that perhaps the previous nights had been the worst of it. Perhaps the combination of the large fire and the visible watch had communicated something to whatever lived in this forest. That we were alert, not vulnerable, not easy to approach without detection. Balashov's mood was excellent. He announced over morning tea that the second night's return from the traps was likely to be as good as the first, and that we would be home before the end of October with enough pelt to make every man's year. He clapped Zakhar Lipov on the shoulder and made a joke about the price of sable in St. Petersburg, and Lipov laughed and said he intended to drink his share in vodka before the year was out. We checked the lines in the morning. The returns were good, not quite the previous day's extraordinary yield, but close enough. 81 total pelts from both lines combined, nearly all sable, with a few high-quality ermine in the eastern section of Gusev's line. Balashov packed and counted and hummed under his breath, and the Orlov brothers reset the lines with the expertise of men who had done this work since childhood. It was Andreev who found the first sign that morning that things were not resolved. He came to me quietly, away from the main group, and showed me the northwest edge of camp. 2 of the horses' feed bags had been removed from the supply pile where they were stacked and moved approximately 30 meters into the trees to the northwest. They had been moved without being opened. They were simply relocated, placed on the snow with a neat, deliberate quality to their positioning that would not have looked out of place if a human being had put them there. I stood and looked at those bags for a long time. Then I picked them up and carried them back to camp and said nothing. But I thought about the direction, northwest. The supply interference on the 4th had been from the north. The breathing Fokin had heard was from the northeast side of the tent. The eyes I had seen were in the northeast tree line. Whatever was doing, this was not confined to a single bearing. It was moving around the camp. It was assessing the camp from multiple directions. It was learning the camp. I spent that day in a state of quiet and sustained dread that I kept to myself because I did not want to create a panic that would cost us control of the situation. I watched everything. I watched the tree line during the midday rest. I walked the perimeter twice and looked at the ground. The new snow from the overnight fall had been partially disturbed in several places around the camp edge. The large compressions with that same distinctive deep sink quality that told you the thing making them was extremely heavy. But the snow had been light and the impressions were not clean enough to read precisely. That afternoon, Fedor Orlov came to me and said he wanted to tell me something that he had not told his brother and had not told Balashov. I said go ahead. He said that on the previous morning, when he had gone to check the eastern end of the trap line alone, he had found a section of the line that had been interfered with. Not in the way that an animal takes a trapped prey item and damages the trap in the process. In that case, you find a sprung trap with the bait disturbed and sometimes blood in the snow and the sign of a struggle. What Fedor found was different. 3 consecutive traps in a 20-meter section of line had been carefully disengaged. The triggers had been depressed without setting off the mechanism, which requires a precise and controlled application of pressure rather than the blunt weight of an animal stepping on the plate. The traps sat in their positions, still baited, springs released, useless. Rendered useless without any disturbance to the surrounding snow. Fedor was a man who had been setting traps since he was a boy, and he knew what that kind of deliberate disengagement meant. It meant something with hands, or something that functioned like hands. Something that understood how the traps worked well enough to neutralize them. He had reset them and said nothing because he was not sure he believed what he was seeing and he did not want to sound like a frightened man. And I told him he did not sound like a frightened man. I told him he sounded like a man who had accurately observed something important. He nodded and went back to work, and I went to find Gusev. Gusev and I stood together at the camp perimeter and I told him everything. The eyes, the breathing at the tent, the relocated feed bags, Fedor's account of the disengaged traps. I told him what Stepan had said about this territory and about the old stories. Gusev listened to all of it without interruption. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said that in his years of military service, he had learned to distinguish between the feeling of general danger and the feeling of specific danger. He said general danger was what you felt during artillery bombardment, a broad and non-directional threat. Specific danger was what you felt when you knew an enemy was close and watching and making tactical decisions about you. He said what he felt in this camp was specific danger. He said he had felt it since the 4th of October and he had been managing it alone since then, and he was glad to know that others felt it too. He said he was going to talk to Balashov. What followed was the most consequential argument of the expedition and perhaps of my working life. Gusev brought me with him, and together we laid the entire account before Balashov in clear and organized terms. Balashov listened. I watched his face and saw the moment when he moved past dismissal and into genuine consideration, which was when Gusev described the disengaged traps. Balashov was a practical man, and the idea of traps being deliberately and skillfully neutralized did not fit into any category of natural animal behavior he was aware of. He sat with that for a while. Then he said he needed one more night. He said the trap lines were set and he was not leaving without the final return. He said we would pack everything, all supplies and non-essential equipment tonight, so that we could move within an hour of pulling the lines tomorrow morning. He said every man would be armed, every man would sleep clothed and booted, and that if any direct contact with whatever was out there occurred, we would fire on it. Gusev said, carefully and without drama, that he did not know what firing on it would accomplish. Balashov said he was willing to find out. Stepan, when I relayed this to him, said nothing. He looked at the fire for a long time, and then he said that he would watch through the entire night without sleeping. He said his sons would do the same. He said that if the Old One came into camp, he would speak to it, that his father had taught him the words for addressing the Old One in the old way, with respect and the acknowledgement of trespass. He said he did not know if this would help, but that it was the only tool he had. I asked him if he had ever used those words before. He said no. We packed that night as Balashov had directed. It was organized and efficient work, the work of men who wanted to be ready. The bundles were lashed to the pack frames, and the frames were arranged in order of loading priority. The horses were brought close to the fire and kept there. Andreev sat with them through the early evening, speaking softly to them, keeping them calm. Balashov had his rifle across his knees. Gusev had his. The Orlov brothers had their hunting pieces. Even Fokin had a small-caliber pistol he had kept in his pack since Yeniseisk and never used. The night was clear. A hard frost had set in and the temperature had dropped sharply since midday, the kind of cold that puts crystals in your exhaled breath and makes your beard stiff within an hour of going outside. The stars were extraordinary, thick and white across the entire sky in the way that only happens when the air is clean and dry and cold. The fire was large and hot. We sat around it in a close group and no one spoke much, and the forest around us was silent in that particular and now familiar way that we had all learned to associate with active attention. Near what I estimated was midnight, the horses began to tremble again, all 11 of them simultaneously, the same deep resonant shaking as before, heads down, ears flat, bodies pressed to the southwest. The tethering line went taut as they all leaned away from the northeast in unison, and the line was good rope and held, but the combined weight and sustained pressure of 11 terrified horses was considerable, and I could see the pine it was tied to flexing slightly. Everyone was awake and upright. Balashov stood with his rifle to his shoulder, aimed at the northeast tree line. Gusev was beside him doing the same. I stood and looked toward the northeast, and in the first moment I saw nothing, only the fire-lit trunks and the darkness beyond them. Say. Then the sound came. It was the sound from the first night, but close, so much closer than before. That low resonant note, but with more complexity to it now that it was near. More layers, a foundation note like a very large log drum, and above it something almost like speech, or what speech might sound like if the mechanism producing it was built to a scale several times larger than a human throat. It lasted longer this time, perhaps 8 to 10 seconds, and it filled the forest entirely, coming from everywhere at once, the way deep sound behaves in cold, dense air, penetrating the trees and the snow and the bones of your chest. I heard Andreev make a sound. I heard Zakhar Lipov say something I could not distinguish. I heard Fokin's pen fall on the snow. Then the sound ended, and the silence after it was absolute. And then, from the northeast tree line, something moved. It came to the edge of the firelight, not rushing, not charging, and it stepped out of the tree line the way a person steps out of a doorway, with the deliberate and unhurried movement of a being that has decided to be visible. It stopped at the boundary of the light and stood there. I will try to describe it accurately and without elaboration, because accuracy is the only thing I owe to the truth of what I saw. It was very large in a way that did not settle into normal perception, standing on 2 legs, fully upright, with a posture that was neither the hunched posture of a bear attempting to stand, nor the listing balance of an injured man. It stood with the complete and easy uprightness of something that was built to stand that way. I estimated its height at 4 meters, perhaps more. I am aware that this estimate sounds impossible. I made it by reference to the trees behind it, new trees whose dimensions I knew because I had been camping beside them for several days. The crown of its head was level with the lower dead branches of the nearest large pine, which I had gauged at approximately 4 to 4.5 meters from the ground. Its body was massive through the shoulders and chest, narrowing at the waist in a proportion that was not entirely unlike a human proportion, but magnified and densified beyond anything natural. Its arms were long, very long, hanging at a relaxed angle that brought the hands, or what I took for hands, to a level well below the knees. The surface of it was difficult to read in the firelight. It was dark, very dark, the color of old wet bark or deep shadow, and its surface did not reflect light in the way that animal fur reflects light. It absorbed the light. It stood in the firelight, and the firelight did not illuminate it so much as define it at its edges, the way you see a dark object against a lit background more clearly than you see it in direct light. Its face I could not see clearly. The firelight did not reach that high with enough strength to resolve detail. I saw the outline of a head that was large and broad, and I saw the eyes again, the amber gold illumination that I had seen in the tree line 2 nights before, and those eyes were directed at the fire and at us, steadily, without blinking that I could detect. It stood. It did not move. It did not make a sound after that initial resonant call. It simply stood at the edge of the light and looked at us, and we looked back at it, and the fire burned between us, and the horses shook and shook against their rope, and no one moved. Stepan stepped forward. He walked to the edge of the firelight, toward the thing, and he stopped about 5 meters from where it stood, and he raised both hands open at his sides, and he began to speak in Evenki. His voice was steady, low and clear and entirely controlled, with the quality of someone speaking formal words that have been memorized and understood. He spoke for perhaps 2 minutes without pausing. I do not know the language. I could not follow the words. I can tell you that the cadence of it was rhythmic and structured. Not conversational speech, but something more formal and deliberate. The cadence of something recited. The thing listened. It did not move while Stepan spoke. It stood in the same posture, at the same point on the boundary of the light, and those golden eyes were directed at Stepan. And when Stepan spoke directly back to them, and the forest was utterly silent around this exchange, so silent that Stepan's voice carried clearly in the cold air, and I felt I could have counted the syllables if I had known the language. When Stepan finished speaking, he lowered his hands slowly and stood still. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the thing turned. Not abruptly, not with the suddenness of a startled animal. It turned with a slow and ponderous deliberateness, the way a very large and very old thing moves when it has no reason to hurry, and it stepped back into the tree line, and within 2 paces it was gone. Not obscured by the darkness of the trees, so much as absorbed into them, the distinction between its dark surface and the dark of the forest closing over it the way water closes over a stone. And the sound of its movement was audible for perhaps 3 more seconds. Heavy, regular, the sound of immense weight displacing snow, rhythmic and receding, moving northeast. Then silence. Stepan came back to the fire and sat down. His sons put their hands on his shoulders. He sat and stared at the fire and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, in Russian, that we needed to leave now. Not in the morning, now, in the dark, with what we had packed. He said the words he had spoken were a formal acknowledgement of trespass and a promise of departure. He said he had promised it in the name of the entire party. He said, if we did not go now, tonight, the promise was broken, and he did not know what would happen, but that nothing good would come of it. Balashov said we needed to wait for daylight to pull the trap lines. So Stepan looked at him and said that the trap lines must be left, that they were part of what we were leaving behind, that taking them would constitute another act of taking from this territory, and that we could not afford to add to what we had already taken. Balashov started to argue, and Gusev said, in a tone I'd never heard from him before, flat and absolute, that they were leaving the trap lines and that if Balashov tried to go back for them, he would go alone. Fedor Orlov said the same. Then his brother. Then Zakhar Lipov, who had been entirely silent since the appearance, said it too. One by one, every man in the party said the same thing. We were leaving. Now, without the lines. Balashov looked around at us, and I watched something move through his expression, the calculation of profit against the weight of what he had just seen, Yes, and the calculation did not take long. He nodded. He said, "Let us go." We loaded the horses in the dark. Every man worked quickly and quietly, with the focused efficiency of people who want to be somewhere else as rapidly as possible. The horses were calmer now, perhaps sensing the intention to leave, or perhaps because the presence in the forest had retreated far enough that they no longer felt it at close range. We lashed the final packs, kicked snow over the fire, and by my estimate, within 40 minutes of Stepan's decision, we were moving southwest along our outbound trail. We traveled through the remainder of that night by the light of the stars and a partial moon that rose around the second hour of our movement and illuminated the snow with a pale, cold light that was sufficient for trail following. Stepan led the column and set a pace that was faster than our usual traveling speed. Not running, the horses could not run heavily loaded through forest snow, but a sustained brisk walk that did not permit rest stops. Nobody asked for rest stops. For the first 2 hours, I was aware at every moment of the possibility that something was following us. I do not know how to describe this with precision. It was not a sound or a sight. It was the deep body awareness that the forest was attended, that the darkness to our rear and flanks was not empty. I looked back frequently during those first hours and saw nothing but trees and shadow and our own trail in the snow, but the feeling did not leave me for a long time. Mikhail Orlov, walking immediately ahead of me in the column, was doing the same thing, I noticed. Looking back, so every 10 minutes or so, his face each time he looked was very controlled and very pale in the starlight. At some point near the end of the second hour, the horses calmed. Not gradually, but quite specifically, as if crossing an invisible line. Their ears came up. Their stride changed. They stopped pressing to the south and began moving more naturally, with the normal forward energy of horses covering ground. Andreev, at the head of the string, noticed it and looked back at me, and I nodded. I felt it too. The forest around us had changed quality. The suspended, attentive silence had given way to the ordinary quiet of a forest at night, and after perhaps 10 more minutes I heard the distant calling of a great grey owl somewhere to the west, and I knew we were outside whatever territory we had been in. We stopped briefly then, and for the first time, and Stepan turned to look back northeast and stood for a moment in stillness. Then he exhaled slowly and said something to his sons in Evenki, and they both nodded. He turned to the rest of us and said that we were out of the Old One's ground. He said we would continue moving and rest for a few hours before dawn and travel all day tomorrow. Balashov said nothing. He was walking and looking at the ground, and he said nothing for a long time. We rested briefly before dawn in a small hollow sheltered by fallen timber. No fire, too close to where we had been for anyone to feel comfortable with firelight. Just wrapped in our furs in the cold and the dark. I do not think anyone slept, though exhaustion had settled into the column like lead. We were up and moving again with the first grey light, and we walked hard all that day and the next, and by the evening of the third day of travel, we had covered enough ground that Stepan judged us properly clear of the territory, and we made a real camp with a real fire, and nobody stood watch, and most of the men slept deeply for the first time in over a week. I lay awake. Not because I was afraid any longer. I do not think I was afraid in that simple way after those first days of travel. I lay awake because I was trying to organize what I had seen into something my mind could hold without it slipping away from me. I've spent a great deal of my life since then doing this, trying to hold it in a form that is honest and complete, without becoming either a ghost story or a dismissal. We arrived back in Yeniseisk in the 3rd week of October. We had 81 sable pelts, a fair return, enough to cover costs and produce modest profit for the men who stayed the full duration. Not the windfall Balashov had envisioned. The trap lines we left behind represented at least another 60 or 70 pelts worth of potential, which Balashov calculated and mentioned once and then never mentioned again. He never organized another expedition to that territory. He continued to operate out of Yeniseisk for many years after, and was by all accounts a successful merchant, but he never went north of the Podkamenya again. Fokin's private journal was, to my knowledge, never published or formally recorded. He showed it to me once more before we parted in Yeniseisk. Let me read through what he had written, and I can tell you that his written account was precise and meticulous and entirely consistent with what I have described here. He was frightened, that much was clear in the prose, but he was a precise man, and precision was his way of managing fear. He moved to Moscow some years later for business reasons, and I lost contact with him. I do not know what became of the journal. Gusev stayed in the Yeniseisk region for many years after, and I encountered him occasionally at trading posts and river stations. We never spoke about what had happened in any direct or analytical way. We would sometimes, in passing, acknowledge it with a look or a brief pause in a conversation. That was enough. Men who have shared a particular experience do not always need to articulate it in order to recognize that the other one knows. The Evenki guides, Stepan and his sons, returned to their territory after the expedition, and I did not see Stepan again for several years. When I did see him, briefly, at a trading post on the Yenisei in 1881, he was in good health and showed no apparent lasting effects from what we had experienced. He seemed, if anything, calmer than before, with the particular equanimity of a man who has encountered exactly what his tradition told him he would encounter, and has survived it by behaving as his tradition instructed. We shook hands, and he looked at me for a moment with a steady and not unkind expression, and then we went our separate ways. I thought about Stepan for a long time after that meeting. I thought about the fact that he had been the least frightened of any of us in that camp, despite having the clearest understanding of what we were dealing with. He was less frightened because he had a framework for it, a way of understanding what it was and what it wanted and how to communicate with it. Fear of the unknown is a different thing from fear in the presence of the known. Stepan's people had known about that thing in the forest for generations. They had named it and studied it and developed a protocol for surviving contact with it. For them, it was not the unknown. It was an old neighbor, dangerous and sovereign and not to be trifled with, but known. We had gone into that forest equipped with rifles and steel traps and commercial confidence and an absolute absence of any framework for understanding what lived there. And the difference between Stepan's experience of those nights and our experience was precisely that difference, the difference between knowledge and ignorance in the face of something genuinely old. I think about this often, even now. There is a habit of mind, common among men of commerce and practical enterprise, that understands wilderness primarily as resource. Forest is timber and fur and mineral potential. River is transportation and fishing. Territory is mapped and claimed and valued and exploited. This is not a bad habit of mind for building civilization, and I am not a man who stands against civilization or the enterprises that sustain it. I spent my working life in exactly that commercial framework. But the forest northeast of the Podkamennaya Tunguska taught me something about the limits of that framework. Taught me that commercial confidence is a thin layer of certainty stretched over a world that is older and stranger and more capacious than the ledgers of any merchant house can accommodate. There are places in this world that are not empty waiting to be filled. There are territories that are already occupied by things that were old before any human language had words for them, and those things do not acknowledge the maps we draw, or the claims we make, or the flags we plant. They acknowledge presence and intention. They know when you are passing through, and they know when you are taking, and they respond to the difference. The taiga to the northeast of Yeniseisk is still there. It has not changed, I think. The trees we camped beneath are still standing, or their successors are, since in the forest renewing itself over decades in ways that look identical from the outside. The trap lines we left are long dissolved into the snow and soil, the steel rusted and scattered, the rawhide bindings rotted away. There is nothing left of our passage in that territory that I can imagine persisting. We were there for 8 days, and we left, and the forest closed over our presence the way water closes over a stone. Something else remains, though. I am as certain of this as I am certain of anything in my life. Something old and patient and territorial remains in that forest, and it is not waiting for us to return, because waiting implies desire, and I do not think it desires our return. I think it is simply there, as it has been there for as long as the forest has been forest, watching the seasons turn and the snow come and go and the occasional small figures of men moving through its territory with their fires and their smells and their noise. Watching us pass through with the enormous patience of a thing that has no reason to hurry, that has no concept of urgency because urgency belongs to creatures with short lives, and its life is measured in a currency we do not have access to. It watched us. It let us know it was watching. It accepted Stepan's acknowledgement and his promise. And it let us go. I've been grateful for that for 53 years. There are men who will read this account and dismiss it. There are men who will say I was young and the cold had affected my judgment and the dark plays tricks on the eyes and that large shadows in a forest at night are precisely that. Large shadows. I cannot argue with these men because I cannot put what I saw in their hands to examine. All I have is this account and the account in Fokin's journal, which I hope still exists somewhere in Moscow, and the memory in my body of what it felt like to stand before that fire in the cold and the silence and watch something ancient and enormous step to the edge of the light and look at us. I know what I saw. The forest knows what it is. That will have to be enough.